Whisper it quietly or make an entire YouTube video out of it, Daniel Ricciardo might be back to his best in Formula 1 and starting to show he could get a Red Bull Racing return after all. Ricciardo was performing at a Red Bull level at the Mexican Grand Prix, literally. He qualified alongside Max Verstappen and outpaced Sergio Perez, which is about as much of a statement as it's possible to make while driving an AlphaTauri. Especially as Ricciardo followed that up with a strong 7th place in the Grand Prix, running ahead of several faster cars for a lot of it and passing every test of his racecraft, tyre management and pace, while Perez completely imploded and wiped himself out at the first corner. This is about much more than a single result. It's what made such a performance possible, the reasons to believe it's sustainable, how much life it breathes into Ricciardo's post-McLaren renaissance, and the fact he looks like he really could be what Red Bull needs from Verstappen's future teammate. Having saved Ricciardo from the despair of his premature McLaren departure by making him a reserve driver for 2023, Red Bull threw him into the AlphaTauri race seat to replace Nick de Vries mid-season to continue his rehabilitation. Since then, a key question has been what Red Bull actually saw in Ricciardo as a racing driver, not just a marketing tool, given the damaging 2 years at McLaren. Red Bull, Ricciardo and those around him have been adamant that he's unravelled the tangled mess his driving technique had become and was capable of getting back to his best. It's taken months to build any kind of case supporting that, thanks to the unexpected setback of Ricciardo breaking his hand just after F1's summer break. But the Mexican Grand Prix weekend was the first sign of something tangible. AlphaTauri has a good track record in Mexico, while Ricciardo's excelled there in the past as well. It's the only place other than Monaco that he's earned a pole position in F1. But this doesn't seem to be just a perfect storm of factors giving team and driver a random high point, nor was qualifying 4th a freakish pulled out all the stops quali special. Ricciardo was much more like his pre-McLaren self in Mexico with some clear and specific reasons for it. Ricciardo was extremely motivated and enthusiastic throughout the Mexico weekend, having described himself as going into it with a chip on my shoulder. That's because he was eager to tap into something he was first intrigued by way back at Zandvoort before his injury, and his first race back in Austin the week before Mexico hadn't given him a chance to do that. Ricciardo drives the car very differently to regular driver Yuki Tsunoda, but also Pierre Gasly, who was AlphaTauri's spearhead for several seasons. They prefer a later braking approach with a sharp later rotation, the V-style that we often hear drivers talk about and that Ricciardo wanted to move away from at McLaren but couldn't. We'll explain this in more detail in a moment, but essentially the way Ricciardo brakes and approaches a corner puts very different demands on the car and the tyres and requires a very different kind of car behaviour. Ricciardo recognised this early on and wanted a bit more of a stronger front end on his AlphaTauri as he felt it could actually handle a bit more rear instability. That might sound a little odd given rear instability was his kryptonite at McLaren, but again, we'll come to that shortly. Pursuing a different setup direction was not the work of a moment, and AlphaTauri started to experiment after the summer break, but Ricciardo only managed 1 and a bit practice sessions at Zandvoort before breaking his hand. Then the first attempt at his second comeback of 2023 in Austin was a bit of a false start. Car damage wrecked his race, but the format of the sprint weekend had also meant locking in the setup early on Friday and not being able to tune the car as he needed. Given it was his first race back from injury, upgrades had changed the car's behaviour in his absence, and the sprint format meant just the 1 practice session before qualifying, AlphaTauri played it safe and put Ricciardo on what we can call Tsunoda's setup. That didn't really work for Ricciardo, so it was all about getting to Mexico and working on different setups to try to unlock a bit more potential from the car based around his driving preferences. Not being able to drive naturally or quickly was killing Ricciardo at McLaren. He prefers to carry more speed through the corner by making it more of a U-shape. To do that, he needs a little rear instability on entry to turn in and enough grip to rotate the car mid-corner without the rear breaking away. The McLaren had a lot of peak downforce, but it wasn't always usable, making the car unstable and inconsistent to drive in certain corners and conditions. That was murder for Ricciardo's preferences. And even now, in a McLaren regularly scoring podiums, Lando Norris says he wants to U a corner but has to V it off, because the car can't handle what he wants. Ricciardo admitted he'd had a limitation exposed by his failure to switch styles in the way Norris could, and even how Ricciardo's replacement at McLaren, Oscar Piastri, has. But give him the right car and he was adamant he could still work wonders. That's what he seems to have with the AlphaTauri, which may lack the aerodynamic peaks of what Ricciardo was driving at McLaren, but it has a more stable platform. AlphaTauri has battled some specific corner entry instability issues of its own all season, mainly when its drivers were braking late into heavy braking zones, and it was initially a concern concern that this might be an issue for Ricciardo. But with the way he drives, Ricciardo found the AT04 didn't create the kind of problems he'd had at McLaren at all. Instead, Ricciardo knows what to expect from this car and is able to take it to its limits more comfortably. There were signs of this right back in Hungary, where Ricciardo drove the AlphaTauri for the first time. But there, and in his second race in Belgium, there was also still a bit of under-rotation in the car. That's why Ricciardo actually found that he could handle a bit more rear instability than it had, to help give him the front end he needs, without it prompting the kind of inconsistency in car behaviour that he couldn't handle the way Norris could at McLaren. Since those initial races with the team, AlphaTauri has added a bit more aero load through upgrades, and the new setup direction has unlocked an even more Ricciardo-friendly balance. But in Mexico, Ricciardo was able to use the stronger front end to rotate the car through the corners more to his style, which means braking a little earlier but riding the brake a little longer, giving him the grip to turn the front in mid-corner and carry the speed through. Doing that with confidence, turning the car into the corner, has been really important to Ricciardo, which is why he was at ease with the car in qualifying in Mexico, visibly leaning on the front more and throwing the car around. He says he's feeling more like his old self, and he's certainly driving a lot more like the Ricciardo from Renault in 2020 and the Red Bull years before that. This continued in the Grand Prix, with Ricciardo looking feisty at both the start and the post-red flag restart, and launching an attack on George Russell's Mercedes on the final lap for 6th. It didn't quite come off, but how often did you see him even be able to try that in a McLaren? This is a timely and important boost for Ricciardo, because whatever Red Bull says about Perez's future, it would be naive to think the team wouldn't act for 2024 if it gets to the end of this year and genuinely thinks Ricciardo is a cast iron better option. And even if there is zero chance of a Red Bull Racing promotion for next season, Ricciardo's gunning for the drive in 2025. So this is one big audition, and the first 2 races Ricciardo managed before his injury were solid but inconclusive, and Austin then offered much of the same. But having brushed off the cobwebs again in the US, then having the freedom of a normal weekend to play around with the setup more in Mexico, Ricciardo looks exactly like the reborn driver that Red Bull was adamant it was seeing on the simulator and in a Red Bull test in the first half of the year. Ricciardo looks confident and fast for the first time in, it's honestly hard to remember. No wonder in Mexico he had the air of someone who felt he'd actually got back somewhere to a level where he's not been at since flashes in 2021. More results like this will turn a slightly quizzical, maybe Ricciardo can offer Red Bull what it needs, into a much more concrete, oh, Ricciardo can offer Red Bull what it needs. He will need to do a lot more than just have one strong weekend and one high-flying qualifying result to get the Red Bull Racing return he really wants. But this performance looks like it really is grounded in a change he understands and has pushed for, which suggests it can be sustained beyond Mexico. And that would prove Ricciardo is not broken as a driver after all, and simply that him in a McLaren was just a freakishly nightmare matchup. If you layer that on all the other aspects that make Ricciardo such an appealing option, like his commercial value, his experience, and his relationship with Verstappen, then the chances of Red Bull picking him will go up. It's as simple as that, because then Ricciardo's case will not just be dependent on Perez underwhelming and Red Bull wanting to get rid of him. Ricciardo will just be the better option. Given the Red Bull driver narrative, Ricciardo out-qualifying Perez at the Mexican's home race and lining up alongside Verstappen for the start of the Grand Prix felt like a scene straight out of the Netflix Drive to Survive docuseries. The circumstances around this were just perfect for a hammed-up Ricciardo vs Perez seat showdown episode. Ongoing question marks over Perez's future, Ricciardo's recent return from injury, and this being Checo's home race. There was also a Christian Horner quote in Friday's press conference just begging to be turned into a talking head, as he stated Red Bull wanted and needed Perez to be on the first couple of rows, then 24 hours later, Ricciardo beat Perez to that very achievement. Throw in the defining image from the start of the race of Perez's Red Bull being sent airborne after he inexplicably and clumsily left Charles Leclerc no space while trying to make it 3 wide on the outside of turn 1, and you've got yourself a vintage Netflix promo. It could hardly have been a more dramatic exit for Perez, but his act of self-sabotage could have bigger consequences than creating the perfect script for Drive to Survive darling Ricciardo. Both drivers are trying to sidestep any questions about their contest for a Red Bull Racing seat in the future. It was always likely they'd continue to be asked about this if Ricciardo maintained this new level, but Perez has now given everyone the ammunition to highlight a very uncomfortable contrast between the two. After Ricciardo's qualifying heroics, it would actually have been unfair to frame the result as a colossal one-sided victory for the Aussie, because Perez produced an objectively good qualifying performance of his own relative to Verstappen. And in the context of his recent struggles, that kind of one-lap pace should have been a real boost to his confidence, underlining his belief that some hard work in the Red Bull simulator has unpicked some wrong directions and put him on a better path. But he undermined that within seconds of the start on Sunday. His heart ruled his head, he ruined a hard weekend's work for his side of the garage, and he's let Lewis Hamilton back into the fight for P2 in the championship. You might not care about that last point, but Red Bull really does. Red Bull keeps emphasising how much it wants Perez to finish second for a reason. Red Bull's never finished 1-2 in the drivers' standings before. If Perez fails to achieve the one goal Red Bull's needed him to in 2023, given the scale of Verstappen's domination, it would be a colossal failure. Meanwhile, Ricciardo's Sunday was as good as it could have been, so if you were Red Bull, who would you be more impressed by? It really was the worst possible time for Perez to implode again. The low points are too low, and even if you take qualifying as a positive, all it really showed is what was already known. It's well established that Perez can be what Red Bull needs from Verstappen's teammate. He just hasn't done it enough, and the Mexico race was as bad as it can get. At the same time, Ricciardo produced the first real evidence that he can do the job, so it's hard to imagine how this weekend could have produced a bigger contrast in their respective cases for being Verstappen's future teammate.